we're going to be working with our friendly horses on rails, trying to recreate it for the purposes of React. If you want to code along and you have a version of this horses on rails, you can do so. You might just, though, in the end, want to. Oh, I guess I need to put my screen back on, don't I? There we are. You might just want to watch because there's a lot to this, and there's a lot of moving pieces that could potentially go wrong. But if you do wish to follow along, I did put together a little gist that has a bunch of the code in it, so that if you do miss anything at any point, you can grab from some of the files there. And so that just has some of the stuff that we'll be working on. So if you get lost at any point, at the top of each file, it basically lists in a comment the location of that file. So when we're working on a particular file, if you don't catch everything that I implement, you can come and reference this document here. All right. I'm going to bring up VS Code. First thing I want to do, because I am working with an experimental feature here, is I want to create a new branch. I'm currently in one of the branches where I implemented active admin. That's going to be my sort of branching point. And so to create a new branch in Git, I do a git checkout -b. And so it's checkout is usually what we do to switch to a branch, but -b is going to allow me to create a new branch. And then I'm going to say adding React. And that has switched me to that new branch. That means if anything goes horribly wrong, I can always switch back to the prior branch, the adding active admin branch, and just throw this work away, which would be fine. Okay, so I've also got like a little to-do list that I'm going to pull up on my other screen here. So first thing first, we're going to implement this using a gem, and the gem is called React Rails. There was actually two gems that I investigated for integrating React with Rails. One was called React Rails. The other one was called React on Rails. They both seemed to offer very, very similar functionality. I found the documentation of the React Rails project slightly better, and so I went with it. But I couldn't really see a major difference between the two. And so hopefully I've chosen wisely. And so first thing first, I want to bring this project into my application, and it's a gem, so I'm going to do it by way of the gem file. And so that is going to happen right here. I've got my project open, make sure I'm in the right project here, that I'm not in something else. Let me just make sure, yeah, that looks good. So I'm going to go to the gem file, and this is where I had previously added in like Faker and active admin and devise, and so I'm going to do a gem react-rails. And after adding in that gem, I need to do from the command line a bundle install. And so that goes pretty quickly for me because I've already run that prior. If you are coding along, it might take a little bit longer to grab that gem and install it. There are two other steps that I need to do at the command line here. One is to go to Rails's JavaScript subsystem, which is called Webpacker, and I want to ask it to install React. So just putting in this gem here, that brings in the React Rails integration, but I haven't actually installed the React library yet, as in like the React NPM module. And so this going to Rails Webpacker install is going to do that for me. So it's Webpacker :install :react. And I will paste that command into the chat in case anyone missed it. That brings in Yarn. Yarn is the dependency management tool that is used with Rails. It's an alternative to using the npm tool. And so it's just the Rails community is standardized on using Yarn instead of the npm tool itself. And then there's one other command that I need to run, and this command came with the gem, with the React Rails gem. So it comes as a generator, Rails generator, and it just says React : install. So this is a separate install from the installing the actual React library. This is part of that gem integration. And so I'll paste that into the chat as well. Okay, so at that point, if I did a git status, we'd see that there are a bunch of modified files and a few new files and folders for me to commit to Git. So I'll do that. A git add, git commit, and I will say installed the React Rails gem and the React JS npm module and dependencies. Great. And I can close this gem file down. So really, I'm going to initially focus on just changing. I'll bring up the just going to imagine that I go to like one of these horses here. I'm also going to fix the fact that the horses on the individual pages render so large. That sort of bothers me. But I'm on a particular show page now of a horse. And this is where I'm going to start. Eventually, I will go and I will recreate the sort of the page that has the multiple horses on it. But we'll start at this show page for a single horse. So I'm at like /horses/some_id. And if I was to go into my application, that's in the app views horses page, and it's the show. So app view horses show. And right now in show, we're rendering a horse partial. I'm going to remove that for now. The other thing I'm going to do is there is now a home for my React components. And this home is in the app JavaScript folder. There is now a folder called components. And so in there, I'm going to put a whole new file, and I'm going to call it horse.js. So that horse.js goes in the app JavaScript components folder. And we're going to build it like a regular React component. So I'm going to say import capital React from React in quotes. And then I'm going to export default a function called horse, like that. That is my horse component. And horse is going to take in some props. There's so many props that belong to a horse. I'm not going to destructure them within the argument list here. I'm just going to use them with the props dot syntax. And then to make something a React component, all I need to do is return some markup. And so I'm going to return a React fragment, which is just a way of providing a root node that effectively is nothing. So it's just a JSX node that has no content. And then inside of there, I'm going to put, just for now, a paragraph tag. And I'm going to say name. And then I'm inside of my curly braces, I'll say props.name. So a very simple component that on the surface is just going to take in some props, specifically looking for a name prop, and then render that name beside the word name inside a paragraph tag. So it's as simple of a component as I can make it. With that in place, then I can just sort of show you what it would be to actually render this inside of a view. And so to render this inside of a view, I have a little helper that came with that React Rails gem. And the helper says React component. That's the name of the helper. Then I mentioned the component that I want to render, and then the props that I want to pass in. And so in this case, I was expecting a name, and I'm just going to hard code in Wally as the value. And if I just go back over here, let's see if I reload this, if that works at all. Component. React component. Yeah, that's how it's supposed to be. Do I have to go and restart all my servers? That's what I need to do. I restart my Rails S server. I have also been running the Webpack dev server, so I'm going to restart that. That's that ./bin/Webpack dev server. That handles my JavaScript assets. And with those things restarted, lo and behold, this is my React component. It doesn't look like much, but there it is. And if I went to my console here, I have the React Dev Tools installed. If you don't have the React Dev Tools installed in your browser, you probably want to go and search and find the React Dev Tools for your particular browser. And then if I click on components here, we'll see that it identifies the horse components on the screen, and then it shows me over here what my props are. And in this case, it's just name Wally. Now, there is a top speed associated with a horse. And so if I go back into the component and I write top speed, props. Yes, if you inspect it, you'll actually see, well, now I'm breaking things, but it is. Brody's asking, so the HTML shows up in the expect element. It is because the expect element shows you the state of the DOM, and React actually does modify the DOM. And so once I fix my component, I'll go and I'll show what Brody's talking about. Before I do that, though, we're going to have top speed. And over in the Rails world, I have top speed set up like this. It's, you know, a variable top underscore speed. But you don't see it if you do view source, Brody. So if you were to hit Control U, you wouldn't see any of it. But it should always be there in the inspect element, because the inspect element doesn't show the source, it shows the state of the DOM as source. The problem with this right here, top underscore speed, is that we're now straddling two different programming languages that have two different conventions around variable naming. In the Ruby world, we use snake case. In the JavaScript world, the convention is camel case, so it should be top speed like that. But I would like to be able to, in the Ruby world, still be able to call out top speed in camel case, because that's how it's going to live inside of my active record object. So if I want to take data from active record and pass it into this component, I would like it so that it would be like automatically switched over from snake case into camel case for the purposes of my component. Now if I go over here and look, reload my component here, currently over here, top speed is top underscore speed. There are handily, though, a few little config settings that I can tweak that will make this sort of an automatic switchover. So I'm going to go and make those switches right now. I have to do some configuration, and I've got to do that in a few places in my config folder. And so here's the config folder. Inside of the config folder, I want to open up two files. One of them is, I think I'm going to create a new initializer. So in this initializers folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it React. And the way that this initializers folder goes, you can see that there's an active admin file in here. Just files that happen to be in this folder, they get run at the time of creation. And so I'm going to use that as a way of doing some configuration. So I've got this React one open here. I also, though, need to do some work inside of these environments. So there's this subfolder inside of config called environments, and these are the three environments in which Rails can run: development, production, and test. I'm going to open up both the development and the production ones, and I'm going to paste in a little bit of a config into there. And so config.react.camelize props. Take my props and camel case them, or camelize them. So I'll paste that into the chat there. And this needs to go inside the do end block within those files. And then inside of this React RB here, I am going to, we're going to be working with another technology inside of our application today, which is how we're going to be eventually sending our props over to our components. We're going to be able to automatically convert from active record objects to the props for our components. We're going to be using something called JBuilder for that. And so I need to configure JBuilder in a particular way, also dealing with camelizing the props. And so I put this command in here, JBuilder. The key format is camelize. And so I'm going to put that in there. And that is just going inside of this React RB file. And then again, with those things in place, I have to restart my Rails S server. So this is just a little bit of setup work. Once we get this out of the way, we can actually start coding once again. It'll work now. I'm highly confident that this will fix the problem, and it does. Top speed 34. Okay, that feels good. What that actually means now is I should be able to, remember, we're inside of the show view for a particular horse, which means that if we looked at the controller for a particular horse, we have access to an @horse variable, which means I should be able to just straight up pass that variable into my React component and have all of its properties camelized and available into the component. Close. All of those got passed in, but they don't get camelized. And this I was expecting. They don't get camelized because this is not, it's not a hash, it's an object. And the truth is, it would be lovely if we could just pass it in and have it work like this. However, the issue is we actually need to pass in a little bit more information than just what's available in the active record object. The active record object gives us all the properties of the component, but we're going to need a little bit more inside of the component itself. So for example, if we go and look at what our horse partial that we're trying to recreate includes in it, the horse partial references the horse image. That doesn't get passed in because it's a special property. That doesn't get passed in when I pass in the active record object. The other thing we're referencing inside of our HTML partial is the horse's breed. Just based on Rails magic, I can get to the breed within the partial by going to horse.breed, following the association, but that doesn't come along for the ride either, just the breed ID does. So we'll lose some of the magic in the transfer over to React. And then lastly, we also want to be able to link to the horse breed. So we need access in the component to the breed's URL. And then we also want to be able to link to the horse itself, because if we are on the listing of, where it's listing multiple horses, we want to be able to link to an individual horse. We want to be able to use Rails's routing system to link to the individual horse. And so we're missing a lot of functionality. So we can't just, when I first started working with this gem, I thought, boom, I'm done. React component, pass the horse. That's how simple it looked in their docs. Unfortunately, not that simple. What we need to do is we need to basically package up the information that we need, including the image, including a bunch of the URLs, things like that. This is where we're gonna bring in a piece of technology called JBuilder. JBuilder is how Ruby builds up JSON. So when you make a Ruby API and you send JSON back, you use JBuilder to structure out the JSON that you want to return. The React component here can also take in JSON as a way of passing in the props to the particular component. So we're going to leverage that ability to use JBuilder to make a nicely encapsulated version of the horse that not only includes all the regular horse properties, but also includes that extra stuff that I went into. So no, there's not a nifty helper to do all of it for us, but we'll leverage some of what's already in Rails. To do that though, what do I want to do? I want to, in the horses folder, so in the views horses folder, I'm going to create a few files, and these are all going to be JBuilder files, and then we're going to look at how the JBuilder syntax works. But I'm going to create the files to begin with. So inside of the horses subfolder, I'm going to create a few new files. One's going to be called _horse.json.jbuilder. So it's a partial, just like our HTML partial, but it's a partial for building JSON. And then I'm going to create another one, and it's going to be called horses, because eventually we want to package up collection of horse data. And so we're going to use JBuilder for that. And in the breed subfolder, we're going to create a file in there because we eventually want to serialize some of the breed data as JSON data as well. So in the breeds view subfolder, I'm going to put in a _breed.json.jbuilder as well. And the way this stuff gets rendered, if I go back to my show, I'm going to at least temporarily leave what I have here with this component just trying to render the horse. But above it, I'm going to put another echo statement, and I'm going to say render horse.json.jbuilder, where the horse that we are rendering is the horse object that we have access to. And with that in place, at least if I go like this and I reload this page, very anticlimactic, but we see a little set of curly braces right there, which is in JSON syntax an empty object. And so currently our representation of a horse is nothing. It's just an empty object, and we're going to go into these various files that we just created, and we're going to populate them with what it means to display the information about the horse. So I'm going to put this on split screen so that we can see this over here a little bit. Oh, I don't want my I don't want my bat showing. Here we are. And then I'll make this smaller. Okay, so we're going to start with the horse.json.jbuilder, and we're going to use this syntax for building up a JSON representation of the horse. So inside of this file, we are going, it's Ruby code, and we have access to a horse variable. So this is similar to how you render a partial, right? You can render a partial and you can have access to a variable inside of that partial. So over here, I'm going to go to, I have a special JSON variable that just is available to me inside of these JBuilder objects. And I'm going to say, extract for me from the horse object that you have access to, the ID and the name and the age and the top speed and the number of legs. And if I reload over here, we're going to see, look at that. There's the ID of 13, the name of Napoleon, the age of 242, the top speed, and look at that, the top speed has been automatically camel cased for us. That's not happening due to the that camelize. That was the other file that we had made in the initializers folder. This idea of having in this React folder, we were asking JBuilder to camelize with an initial lowercase letter for the key format. And so it just automatically builds our JSON with camel cases, which is lovely. That's a lovely, lovely thing. And so now if we were to go back to our view here,
I have seen the image.
Yeah, the image I have not brought in yet. I haven't brought in any of the URLs or the image yet. And so I will be bringing those in, but in a moment. So I'm going to leave that rendering up top, but I'm also going to copy and paste that whole line, and instead of rendering, and I'll leave the word render in there, but I'm going to capture that to a variable called props. And I'm going to pass that into my component. And look at that, the top speed is now populated. My component is not very complicated, it's just the name and the top speed. But we're now at a point where I can pass in these props that are coming from this JBuilder, and the data is being correctly extracted out of the horse and put into the props that get passed in here. Everything gets camelized. If I went and looked at the React plugin here, we would see the props being passed in are age, ID, name, number of legs, top speed, all properly camelized. It's getting us a little bit further. I have to continue to work with this, but I want to do one other thing, and that one other thing is to make a little helper to make working with this all that much easier, or at least a little less awkward. When we use things like the link to helper or the image tag helper inside of our views, we can also create our own helpers, little things that will make things for us inside of our views. Just like there, when I first started talking about partials, there was sort of the short form of doing things and then the long form of doing things. I'm currently using the short form for rendering out my JBuilder props. However, what I found when I started continuing on, there's going to eventually become a time where I have to start using the full form, and then it gets really, really messy and it makes the views really, really long. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little helper that takes some of that mess and sort of hides it away in another file, in the application helper file. And so I'm going to go open that file up here. Maybe before I do so, I will just make a little git commit. I'll do a git status, see what has changed. I'll say git add, git commit. I'm going to say created the start of a horse React component and some JBuilders. And now inside of the app folder, there's a folder that we've never been in before, which is the app helpers folder. It used to be much more common in Rails to make custom helpers. It's not as common as it used to be. And as you can see, there's places where you can put helpers that are related specifically to your various controllers. But I am just going to go into this one called application helper. And this is one of the things that I have in that gist that I sent earlier to the chat. So I'm just going to copy and paste this from that gist. And so if you are coding along, you'll want to do the same thing. Here you can see this is the sort of the long form way of rendering a JBuilder partial. I didn't want to have to include all of this stuff inside of every one of my views. I didn't want it to get that messy. I wanted things to look nice and simple and sweet inside of those views. And so a big sort of thing that I picked up from the Ruby community is like anytime you have some complexity that once it's in place doesn't really change and it's not serving anyone to expose that complexity, you get to hide it. Just go hide it. Go hide it away. Put it inside of a method or a class method within a class. And so in this case, I've hid it inside of a helper. It's we don't need to necessarily look at this again once it's happening. All this is doing is it's setting up a new JBuilder template in the long form style, and I can pass in the name of a JBuilder partial and then the local variables that I want to use with that partial. And I've just called it JBuild props. And so that will make working with it a little bit easier here. It's right now it's not going to look like much has changed. I'm just going to say JBuild props here, and I'm passing to JBuild props the JBuilder template that I'm working with, and then the local variables that I want to make available to me inside of that. And with that in place, it should still work in the same way. So reloading it, it still works in the same way. So I apologize for introducing that complexity, but there is really no way to get around it. I was able to run with just rendering for quite a while, and then while I was getting more and more complex with what I was doing inside of the various JBuilders, I had to go to that expanded form, and so that's why I've hidden that away inside of this helper. But now that it's there, I can just close it up, and I can do a git status, and I can say hid some JBuilder partial rendering complexity inside of a helper. And now I can continue to do what I was hoping to do, which was to sort of continue to build out these JBuilt things. So as I said, along with the horse's ID, name, age, top speed, and number of legs, I want some other stuff. I want a URL to the horse path. I want a URL to the image path, and then I want a nested breed. And so the way of doing that is I'm going to say json.url. So after I've extracted a bunch of properties from this, I can use this again, go back to this special variable JSON, and I can add new properties by just saying dot and whatever I want to call them. So there's no special meaning to the word URL here. I just want to add something, a property called URL. And what I want to assign it to is the horse path for this particular horse. So I use my horse path helper, which is available inside of all views, including JBuilder views. I also want to get access to the image URL. So I'm going to go to JSON and make a image URL available like that. I don't know why it's such a pretty color orange like that, or yellow. And then here I have a special helper, which I love typing in, called Rails blob path. And the Rails blob path. I need to say, give me the blob path for the horse image, but only the path, please. So only path is true. And then with that in place, if I reload this, look what's inside of my JSON. I have a URL key value pair that leads to /horses/13. That's the URL of the horse that we're on. That's cool. And then I have an image URL which leads to this crazy path, which is the actual path of the image. And if you don't believe me, I can copy and paste this path and put it right after localhost, and there's the image. And so this Rails blob path is just a way of requesting from active storage, like, where the heck is this file? How do I get to this image file or this asset file? And then lastly, I want to nest in the concept of a breed. And so for that, I'm actually going to go to first build up the concept of the breed inside of the breed.json.jbuilder. And so inside of there, I'm just going to say json.extract, like I did before, from the breed's ID and the breed's name. And then further to that, add a URL property, which is going to point to the breed path so that we can link to this particular breed. I may never use this directly just as JSON for the breed, but I'm going to use it in a nested manner with my horse. So JSON extract exclamation mark from a breed variable, the ID and the name, and then add a new property called URL, which will go to the breed path of that particular breed. That way we can click on the name of a breed inside of the horse card and get back to the breed's show page. And so over here, the last thing I need to do to include that is when you want something to be nested, you say json.breed, and you make a do end, and then I can say render a partial within this partial, which is the breed's breed partial. So I sort of have to do a pseudo path to it. It's in the breed subfolder. That's where this file is, and it's called breed. And the .json.jbuilder is optional at this point. And then I can say the breed in this case is the horse object that I'm currently working with, .breed. And if I go back over here and I reload this page one last time, I get a huge error. Oh, this is an error that I ran into, and I thought I had solved it with that little... You were supposed to be solved. You were supposed to be solved, and you're misbehaving. That was the whole point of that expanded form complexity that we hid away in the application helper. So what it's basically telling me is it doesn't know where this partial is. But the problem is it's looking for it as an HTML partial, not as a JSON partial. Will it function better if I explicitly say that it's a JBuilder? I didn't have to do that before. Okay, so that's a mistake that's in the gist that I posted. Not sure why I have to do that this time when it wasn't a requirement before, but that's fine. That's okay. Oh, I actually do know why. I actually do know why, Kyle. Don't you know? I'm still here using sort of the old style render to display that stuff. This initial display of my JBuilder is actually not going through my JBuild props. And so that's why that was a problem. I might just get rid of that render statement now to simplify my JBuilder. I guess there's nothing wrong with having it be explicit there. But again, if I go here and I go to my component, you can see within the component, and it'll probably be a little bit hard to read this text here because it's quite small. I don't know if I can make it any bigger. That doesn't make that text bigger. But you can see now I have age, ID, the image URLs coming along the ride for the URLs coming along the ride, and I've got a nested breed now. The nested breed is there that includes the ID, the name, and the URL. All of that setup, I can now actually get to making my component to recreate what was present before in Rails. Before I do that, does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns? Yeah, I don't have you don't need the echo statement here, Brody. So if you have the echo here, it probably continues to display the JSON. We can get rid of that. And in fact, now that this is really tiny, we could probably get away with like putting that right here, like right in line, right? So I could take this whole thing and I could put it right about here-ish. Didn't quite get the spacing correct there. And that should still do the same thing. Still passing in, still got all the nested stuff. And that looks rather concise. So I want a React component. I say, give me the horse component. I want the props. Well, the props are coming from this JBuilder and their data is based off of this current horse. That looks pretty good. That looks pretty good, doesn't it? And we can now actually go and implement this horse. But we've been at it for, you know, an hour. I mean, minus the fact that I disappeared for a while. Do y'all have any questions or do y'all want a break? Hello, hello. I'm back. I have returned. Let me see, where am I at here? Status. I've got a few more things that I'm going to check into my version control. And so I'm going to say git add, git commit. JBuilders are in place, ready to build out the horse component. And so for this horse component, I'm not going to make you watch me build it out piece by piece. I already built it ahead of time. It's in the gist that I shared earlier. So I'm going to copy and paste much of that directly into here. Deleting what's in there right now and pasting in this whole thing. In the copy paste bin that I provided, I still had the extra sort of empty square brace, or I still had these things, the little empty tag at the top and bottom. Those actually aren't required anymore because I do have one main div. So those are only required if you don't really have or need a root element. But here I do have a root element. So in this component here, we're bringing in props. I haven't destructured them. So you'll see I'm using props dot to make use of all of the various props. And so number of legs, top speed, nesting in to get props.breed.url and props.breed.name for this link right here that links to the individual breed pages. To make the image tag, I'm doing an image and I'm setting the source of the image to the props image URL, and I'm setting the alt of the image to the name of the horse. Let's go and see if this actually is working. Lo and behold, look at that. Look at that beautiful looking horse. It's back to what things looked like before, and I've made the added fix of making it a little bit smaller, right? It's not expanding to the whole page anymore. It does when I go down smaller, but that's okay. Do I hear a question out there, a comment, a concern? Or just someone temporarily putting their microphone on?
Excellent.
No problem. Okay, so that is the recreation, but we're only using that on the show page. It's not being used on the page of the individual collections, right? On the breeds page. So we want to recreate that now. That's not going to be as big of a problem now that we have all of our infrastructure in place. We've got a place to put a JBuilder for a collection of horses, but that's really just going to be based off of the JBuilder that we already have for a horse. We are going to still be able to reuse the JBuild props helper that we built. So this part of it should go a little bit smoother now that we have that sort of infrastructure in place. And so I'm going to close a few tabs here just to simplify some things. I'm going to close this show because we don't really need that anymore. And I'm going to go open up the show inside of the breeds subfolder. The show inside of the breeds subfolder currently looks like this. I'm rendering the ERB partial over and over, and I'm doing it inside of this div with a class of columns is multi-line. Okay, so I need to recreate that. Basically what I need now is another React component. I need a React component that will be like the horse grid into which I can put these various horses. And so I'm going to, in my components folder, make a new file called horsegrid.js. And again, the contents of this is already coded out for us inside of that copy paste file. If only coding was so easy, if there was just a copy paste file for everything, we could just go and grab it all. So I'm going to paste that in here. This horse grid, not that complicated. I'm importing React from React. I'm importing the horse component from ./horse, which is just our other component file. So thankfully we have made the horse component the export default, and so I can import it in this other file. And then setting up a horse grid, all I'm doing is I'm getting some props. In this case, the props are going to be a collection of horses, and then I'm just using map to visit every horse and render out a horse component. Now, there's some magic happening here, some React magic happening here. Two things. One, we saw when we were first learning React that when you map over a collection of React components, React really wants you to provide a unique identifier as a key. And so I'm doing that here. I said the key is, and then the unique identifier in our case is that every one of the horses originally was an active record object, and so it has a unique identifier in its ID property. And so I'm just saying key should be ID. Now, really, for each horse, we need to provide like a horse's name, which is something, and the horse's age, which is something, and a horse's like top speed, which is something. But instead of putting those all in there one by one by one, I have this horse object from a collection of horses, and each horse object has a name property, an age property, a top speed property. The spread operator comes to the rescue. We can actually spread out all those properties as props within the component. So I can just say inside of curly braces .. horse, and we just spread the properties of the horse object into props of the horse component. And so we could have manually done that, right? We could have said like name is horse dot name, and age is horse dot age, etc., etc. But now that we're working with modern JavaScript, we can just use that spread syntax to do that heavy lifting for us. So there's nothing wrong with had we done it manually, but we have this available to us, so why not use it? So beyond that, beyond this idea of the horse grid, I still need to do one more thing, which is the JBuilder for a collection of horses. That's empty right now. We have to, basically what we want is we're gonna want this JBuilder to create something that is gonna look like this. It's gonna say horses, colon, and then there's going to be an array, and inside of that array is going to be a series of horses, where each horse is going to be you know, what we had before. Like each horse is going to have a name, and each horse is going to have an age, etc., etc. So that's what I want this JBuilder to build out, is an object at the highest level with a horses key that points to an array, and that array will have my individual horses in it. And so I'm going to show you the JBuilder syntax for that. Most of it is just going to build off of the, move this over here. This is what we've already described the JBuilder, what a horse should look like when converted to JSON. So when we're over here, within the horses, it's just a matter of saying JSON dot horses. So give me a horses key in a JSON object. Take a horses variable, and then for each horse, just go to the partial for the horse and use that horse as the object. I found that while I was doing this before class today, I stopped being able to read the word horse properly. That's just one of those things that happens. I guess it happens to everyone, where maybe it's just me, but I just, by looking at the word horse for such a long time, it just doesn't look right anymore. It just looks like a really weird word. Horse. Anyways, I don't know. Do you find that? Do you find that horse looks weird right now? I find it looks very odd. That's all I need to do, though. I'm basically just setting up what a collection of horses should look like inside of this this builder. So I go back over here. This is in my breed show page. I'm going to initially just say JBuild props, and I'm going to describe what the first I'll just spit it out as JSON so we can see if it looks right, and then we'll hand it over to that horse grid component. So JBuild props, I'm going to echo it out here. I'm going to say we're going to go to the horses folders, horses.json.jbuilder template, and the horses in question are going to be the current breeds horses. So this right here is pointing to this template that we just built out, which itself references this other template that we have previously built. And then this template assumes access to a horse collection that it loops over. I have to say what that is, and in this case we're on the breed page, so I'm going to go from the breed to the horses that belong to that breed, and then that is the collection that will be rendered. So if I go back to my page here and I reload it, oh yeah, back to this error again. Ah, my favorite error of them all, the missing partial error. Let's see if we could solve this problem. We've solved it already once or twice before. This is happening inside of my JBuilder template, and so let me just see here. JBuild props horses JBuilder dot. Oh, it's just me typing, not finishing typing the word JBuilder. And look at that. So if you didn't catch that, I just forgot the ER at the end of JBuilder. I wrote JBuild. trying to get there faster. And here is the, at the outermost level, it is a object with a horses key that points to a square braced array, and then inside of that square braced array is each one of the horses that belongs to this particular breed. So there's the horse named Napoleon, here's the horse named Universe, etc., etc., etc. And so all that is left here is we don't really just want to output the JBuild props here. We actually want to output the React component, which is our horse grid. And then the JBuild props are just the props that we want to pass to that horse grid. Let me just see if that solves the problem. And look at that. There is our collection of horses. They are now being rendered as React components. And so for each one of them, we can click on the name. We can get over here through to the show page. From the show page, we can click back on the name of the breed, and that will take us back to the collection of horses. There's still a little bit that I wanted to do. There's still some stuff that's not quite working like it worked before. For example, here we have links to our various horses. And here's Kit Kat. When I click through, when we had things set up with ERB views with our regular old partials, we had a Boolean that we passed into the partial that made it so that the link didn't show on the show page. We don't have to link to ourself on the show page. And so I would like to be able to suppress that. And then the other thing that sort of bothers me just the tiniest bit is that when we're on the breed page, everything lines up nicely. See this nice line here? And the edge of the image sort of follows the edge of this search form, and the letter H, everything's lining up. You know how much I like things to line up. But when we're on the individual page, look at that thing. It's just, it's in a little bit. It's moved over a little bit. I don't like that. So I'd like to be able to like knock it back just a little bit to the left with some inline styling. Before I do that, does anyone have any questions? So Brody has the same exact question that some students had in the other section, and I think it's worth discussing this, which is like, what's the benefit here? Like, why is this any better, or is this any better than what we had before? And the answer is, like in my mind, it's not really better. However, there's a big however here. We haven't layered in any of what makes React special, which is reactivity, right? So if you were to take a set of Rails views and convert them to React just for the sake of leaving them the same, there would be no point, right? You would just be doing a bunch of extra work and arriving back at the same situation. However, if you needed some extra reactivity in your application, well, at that point, it might be beneficial to you. So at the end of class today, before we're done, I'm going to jump into another branch that I was working on, and I'm going to show you some extra stuff that I've added in that will actually show off maybe why you would want to go to this extent. However, you know, this does point to something that I think the web world has sort of forgotten. When I first discovered Rails back in, I think it was like 2008, it was a huge breath of fresh air because it just reduced the amount of work that I needed to do to actually ship web applications. So when I was doing contract work on the side, if I had a contract, you know, that I normally maybe would work on with a few people, I would be able to actually do the same contract all on my own and ship way faster than I'd ever been able to ship. And you know, as Rails got newer and newer versions, more and more things were added to Rails, and I just got faster and faster and faster. When I learned React and started layering React into my process, I started getting slower again. And that's because React on its own, as you can see, adds in a lot of complexity. Now, there are some frameworks that are actually built around React that bring back some of that simplicity, but they sort of go outside of the scope of this course. And so React on its own, like Facebook, the people that created React, they don't even like to call React a framework. They just call it a library. And then there's a bunch of other open source products or frameworks that have been built around React to layer in sort of more conventions and simplicities and sort of take away some of the complexity that React has layered back into the web world. So just to quickly look at some of those, one of the most popular is Next.js. It is a framework that's built around React. It layers in things like a routing system that is based on, you know, the location that you put files in various folders, and it gives you, it's basically like React with some Railsy stuff on the front end. And so when you build an Next.js application, you aren't just starting from scratch. You've got some stuff to make you a little bit faster. And then the other one that's quite popular these days is Gatsby. Not the Great Gatsby, but Gatsby, which is another framework sort of focused around building static sites. But again, it's built on React, but again, giving you some of the conventions that make frameworks like Rails really, really quick. So yeah, I just thought it would be good just to talk about that a little bit, because yeah, if we're just recreating things in React for the sake of using React, but we're not layering in any interactivity, well then you might as well just be sticking with Rails. You're only going to slow yourself down. But that said, at the end of class today, I will show some interesting possibilities for layering interaction into these components once we got them going. The other thing that's just really common these days as well is in the workforce, there's a lot of programmers now, client-side programmers that know React. So if you are a dev shop and you've hired on a bunch of junior developers and they know how to build React, how are you going to spend your time? Are you going to spend your time, if you're an existing Rails shop, are you going to spend your time teaching them Rails and how to build up Rails views? Or are you maybe going to leverage their existing React knowledge and have them work in something like React within Rails? And so some shops might decide, say, okay, we'll take these new developers that already know React and we'll bring them into our process, keeping Rails for some of it, but allowing them to use their React skills as well. So there's trade-offs. Let's get back to the coding for a moment. Yes, can I see the React RB code? Sure, that's the JBuilder dealio. That's in the initializers folder. So this is what you wanted to see. I can paste this into the chat. There it is. Okay, so what I wanted to do now is just a few little niceties. One of them is just this initial one of like, when I'm on an individual show page, get rid of that link. The names of the horses should be links on the collection page, but not on the individual page. And if we were to look into my horse component, we would see that the component already supports that. If you look around here, line 13 to 15, we have this little ternary that says props.showpage. And if it's on the show page, just show the props.name. Otherwise, show the link. So the capability is already built in. I sort of pre-built that into my component, but I need to get a new prop in there, something called show page. And so that's over on the horse show.html.erb, JBuild props here is returning to us an object that has all of our JBuilder structured stuff on it. I need to get a little bit more information in there. I need, along with those JBuild props, I want to have some way of setting the show page to true. All of this is returning a Ruby hash right now. And so all I really need to do is I can use, no, I don't want to delete it. I can use .merge to merge in a new key value pair. And so I'm going to merge in, I'm going to say show page true. And let me just make sure that that actually worked, and then I'll go back to the code, or I'll bring the code up here at the same time. And there we are on the show page. Look at that. It's not a link anymore. But if I go back to the breed page, they are links. They are links. But they're not links here. So I can add to the JBuild props at any time by just merging in more props. Feels a little bit like a hack, but I don't think it's the end of the world, right? Because all of this stuff relates to a horse in particular. This stuff doesn't really relate to the horse object in and of itself, so it doesn't really belong inside of the JBuilder, because the JBuilder won't know if we're on a show page or not. So it makes sense to sort of tack it on at the end. And we can rely on the fact that when something, when a property doesn't exist in JavaScript, that property in JavaScript will be sort of falsy. And so when I am rendering the React component on the breeds page, I don't need to pass in that show page and set it to false. If it hasn't been set at all, props.showpage will just be falsy. And when it's falsy, it'll just show just the name. So we're just leveraging the fact that if that's nil or null in JavaScript, it'll evaluate as false for the ternary operator and get here. So we only need to pass in show page once on the actual horse show page. The other thing that I said that was bothering me was this fact that this is sort of pushed over by, I think it's 0.75 EMs. It's just like a tiny little thing, but it bothers me. And if you were working, I think I've got this fixation on things lining up because I'm not the best designer in the world. So when I do commercial projects, I usually bring in designers to work with me. I have a few designers that I'll bring on to work with me. And they are always so focused on alignment that when I take their designs and I integrate them into my final builds for the sites that I'm building, they'll come back to me and say, Kyle, you know, this alignment's off, this alignment's off, and this alignment's off, and I'll go crazy trying to pixel push things around. And so it's just got me always thinking about that. And so this is, I know this would come back to me, and the designer would be like, nope, Kyle, not good enough. The alignment's off. And so we're going to do some pixel pushing here. And so I'm going to go back here. That pixel pushing only needs to happen on the show page. And we already have something that lets us know if we're on the show page or not, which is this props show page. We also have the ability to assign style overrides with the style attribute inside of JSX. And so what I'm going to do here is up top here, I'm going to create a constant and I'm going to call it style override. And I'm going to set that equal to, and I'm going to say when props.showpage is true, the style override is going to be margin left. That's the left-hand margin. I want to push it over, and I know that it's 0.75 EM, not just because I can eyeball that, but because I went and looked in the inspector earlier. Now, this isn't actually CSS, so I have to rewrite that in terms of like the pseudo CSS that we can use within JSX. So anything with a dash in it becomes camel case, and anything on the right-hand side ends up becoming a string. So it looks like we're embedding CSS, but really we're embedding this sort of pseudo CSS. And so that's if we're on the show page. If we're not on the show page, well, then I don't need an override at all. So it'll just be an empty object. And then I can say here, style equals that style override. And let me just see if that fixed things up. Oh, it did. Look at that. Look at that. Look how nice it lines up. That just makes me so happy. And then if I go back to Tinker Horse here, it's lined up as well. Everything's lined up. The reason why that alignment was off is because inside of the horse grid, each individual horse is inside of this div with a class of columns, which makes sure that there's no extra padding there. But when we were just on the show page, we weren't rendering everything inside of columns. We were just rendering our component all on its own. And so we needed to have this little tiny fix. It's a bit of a hack. It's a bit of what you would call a kludge. And so sometimes when I put kludges into my code, I say kludge, and then maybe in the commit message I would put a bit of a description of why I've included this kludge, because someone else is going to come into this code if I'm on a multi-team project, and they're going to be like, well, what the heck is this style override for? Like, what kind of kludge is this? And so usually this is something that you would want to document either in an inline comment, or these days it's more common to actually document those kind of choices inside of your commit messages, so someone can go and see the message that you put in when you made that commit and see if you have an explanation for why you've put in a weird kludge into your code. Okay, that'll do us. Let's do a git status here, git add, git commit -m, finished the horse and horse grid components, slight CSS kludge in the horse component to push the card over when on the show page. So I promised that at the end of the class that I would show you some sort of some reactivity added on to this thing. And so if I do git branch, we'll see that I have a few different branches that I've been messing around with here. I'm always quite branch heavy when I work in a project. Branches are super cheap, and they're a really easy way to give me confidence when I'm building out a project. And so I'm gonna do a git checkout of the React with JBuilder comment trial that I was working on earlier, and I'm gonna do a Rails DB migrate to bring the database up to speed here. Probably don't actually need to do that because I'm not going to involve the database just yet. But, and then over here, I'm going to do a Rails S, so restarting my server. And over here, I'm going to restart the Webpack dev server. And let's see. Everything basically looks the same, but what you'll see is if I go, I can go around to my various pages. On each one of them, you can see that there's now a comment button. And so I thought one of the things I could do is to add some interactivity to these various components would be to say, like, what if someone wants to comment on a horse? And so I have a comments table. So if I went over here and we looked at my DB schema, the old schema here, I have a comments table, and it's just a very simple comments table. I don't have users or anything right now, so I didn't bother having that kind of functionality. It just has some content for the comment, which is text, and then a reference to which horse you are commenting on. And if you click on the comment button, it pops up a modal. This long string here was me doing some debugging, so just ignore that for a moment. Pops up a modal, and that modal is very quick and instantaneous, right? It's not like it's Rails loading up a whole new page. It's just popping the modal up on top of the existing page. I could then type in, this is my comment about this horse named Lacey, and I could submit that. Also, I could go in, and if I realize I don't want to make a comment, I could use this X over here to X out, and I even made it to sort of X out if I click anywhere. So if I just click the background anywhere. And so this is just the very beginning of sort of the kind of reactivity that you can layer on to an application once you have React involved. So yes, it was a lot of work to get basically back to where we were to begin with Rails views, but implementing something like this with Rails would be more complicated, right? Like you would have to bring in JavaScript to have a modal like this pop up. I'm using it by way of React to bring it in. I mean, this is something you could do with vanilla JavaScript. It's something you could do with something like jQuery, but again, it's this kind of reactivity is the reason why we bring React into an application, right? So if you think about the kind of websites that you visit on a daily basis online, some of those websites are really just like static content websites without a lot of interaction. Those kind of websites, it really wouldn't make much sense to code them with something like React, because you'd be doing a lot of extra work based around something that just, could be static HTML or maybe a little bit of Rails or PHP mixed in. But the minute you want something that looks and feels and acts a little bit more like an application that has things like, modals, or like, if you think about, using Gmail, like you would not want to build the Gmail application in Rails on its own, right? It is effectively a very powerful application, and so you would want JavaScript involved, and building it in just plain old JavaScript would be crazy because that would just be so much complexity. So reining in that complexity with something like React, which does bring in some of its own complexity, it would make sense. So this is all I wanted to show, was that after a while, once you've laid the groundwork of bringing React into your application, then you could start doing some really interesting stuff with it. It still does get fairly complicated. Like the reason why this weird code here is integrated is when I submit this form and I want to submit it to Rails, well, anytime Rails has a form that's being submitted, so I also sort of, just for testing purposes, have like a scaffold for creating these comments. When I want to create a comment, I type in the comment and I type in like the horse that this comment relates to. But if I look behind the scenes here, if I do a Control U and I look at the form that is associated with this comment, I'll see that in any given Rails form, there's always a hidden input called authenticity token, and it has a value which is a long string of characters. This is to prevent what's called cross-site forgery, cross-site request forgery, CSRF. Is that the acronym? CSRF, cross-site request forgeries. It's a particular type of web attack that exploits forms, and Rails protects for that exploitation by putting in a token here and then checking to see if it gets the same value back. And this prevents these kind of, I won't go into the hairy details of how CSRF attacks work, but they're a very, very common type of attack on the web, probably second only to cross-site scripting attacks. And so having this protection in place solves that. But if I'm going to go and try to submit a form that was produced by React, well, that's going to be problematic because my React form doesn't have that token in it. And so I have to sort of provision that token to React in some way. Thankfully, Rails stashes a version of that token in a meta tag. And so I can actually use the DOM to go and find the token. And then when I make my submission, because to actually submit this form, I don't get to use a regular old form anymore. I have to submit this form by way of a fetch request. I have to include with that fetch request this authenticity token. And then that'll get me around Rails's CRSF protection, and it will make it so that my forms aren't vulnerable to CSRF protection, that they're not vulnerable to CSRF attacks. And so again, even something as simple as a form, when you layer in React, it does become more complicated. So, and that's another reason why I say for the project, for those of you who do not have prior React experience, I wouldn't try to go too wild with React in your applications. You might sprinkle in a little bit of React into your app to do something a little bit more interactive, but building the entire system around React is probably not something you want to do, just because of the amount of extra work that is required. Now, last term, I went even further and I taught a whole series of lectures on using Rails as a backend JSON only API, and then having, you know, React as a front end. I'm not going to go through that process again this term, simply because that even adds even more complexity. So if you thought the amount of complexity that I unleashed on you today was a lot, it's even, you know, probably 3 or 4 fold more complex if you go into that world of API on the back end and React on the front end. Now, that said, you can still access my lectures from last term. So if you do have a lot of React experience and you want to go that route, if you go to the recorded lectures section of our Teams shell, you can see that I have a section here that says React with Rails API. It previously said coming soon, but I'm going to delete that. And it says previous term videos, and there's an entire video for building up a Rails API. And you already learned some of what's involved with building up a Rails API, because it's all based on JBuilder. You basically create a bunch of JBuilder views to structure how your RESTful API is going to hand off JSON data to the caller. And then there's a whole other video on making use of that API from a React application, pulling down that JSON by way of fetch requests. And then I also go into how you can go about submitting requests as well with your own forms within React. So if you still really like that idea of React on the front end, Rails API in the back end, you can see those 2 videos from last term. But I think for most people, the amount of complexity that is brought in at that point is probably too much to pick up this term, especially because we're in the middle of a pandemic and we're all at home, and you know, so it's probably not the time to add even more stress to your life with that. And so Adam is saying maybe quickly finish the project and build a static React web page that consumes some API afterwards. I mean, potentially. For those of you who are interested, you might still even want to watch these afterwards. Like it really is becoming more common in the web world to build applications in this style, the style of an API on the back end with React on the front end. It might sound like I'm a little down on React. I think React is a really cool technology, but I do think it adds a lot of complexity. And I think that in the web world, for some reason, we've all sort of gotten okay with dealing with a really high level of complexity in our workflow. And I don't think it's okay. I think our budget for complexity has gone up too high, and I'd like to return to a little bit of a simpler world. And so I'm trying to impose a little bit of a simpler world on you this term by not digging into this pattern, even though it is a common pattern in industry. So these videos are available for you. I will also send them along with you at the end of the course in case you want to look this over after you graduate, if you end up in a situation where you're working with an API on the back end and you've got React on the front end, you can look at this React with Rails API video. It's sort of at that point Rails agnostic. It's just React with a API in the back end. Anyways, I'm yammering on now. We're done, class. Any final questions or comments or concerns or anything you want to raise at this point before we go? Crickets, which is just fine by me. I'll give us a little bit of R2D2. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming to class and watching me re-implement the horses on Rails with React components.